Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's your host, Joe Cirincione.
Thank you, Del, and welcome back to another episode of Press the Button, our 19th. If you've missed any of the previous episodes, you can go to ploughshares.org and download them, listen to them on SoundCloud, stream them on your devices. That's Ploughshares, P-L-O-U-G-H, spelled the English way, ploughshares.org. Our interview this week is with Bill Hartung. He is the man on military budgets. He knows who gets the money and what we're getting for all the billions of dollars we pay them. He is the director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. He helps us shine a light on the economics and politics of the nuclear industrial complex. But before that, we will do Early Warning, our weekly summary of the nuclear news. We're joined this week by Jessica Lee, the Senior Director of the Council of Korean Americans, and by Mary Kaszynski, the Deputy Director of Policy here at Ploughshares, discussing the latest with North Korea and Iran. But first, a quick announcement. While I was gone, Michelle Dover, our co-host, asked you, our listeners, to send questions in to me that I would answer, what you want to know. We got a lot of questions, so we decided we're going to make this a regular feature. We're going to start answering one a week, starting this week, right in between Early Warning and the interview. It's a short 3-minute segment, but I think you're going to like it. And that means because it's a regular feature, we're going to keep the phone lines open. Please send your questions in to me, Joe Cirincione, at pressthebutton@ploughshares.org. Press the button, one word, at ploughshares.org. And make sure you listen to the podcast. It goes up every Tuesday, and it's up all week. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have a minute, please rate, like, and share the podcast with your friends and family. And now, the news.
And now, Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm delighted to be joined for Early Warning this week by Jessica Lee, who's the Senior Director of the Council of Korean Americans, and Mary Kaszynski, our Deputy Director of Policy here at Ploughshares. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Great. I want to start with you, Mary, right off on Iran, because we've got a couple of stories to cover today. And let me start with something that's not happening in the Middle East, but is happening in Foggy Bottom, a State Department attempted purge of dissenters. Tell us about what's going on.
Exactly. So there have been some emails and some rumors that Trump administration officials at the State Department have been systemically harassing and pushing out career officials based on supposedly political reasons that these officials were promoting Obama administration policies. The State Department Office of Inspector General just released a report last week. They've been looking into these allegations, and they found that, in fact, this was true, that Trump administration officials have been pushing out employees for betraying Trump administration policies. Again, it was a systemic harassment, accusations of betrayal and things like that. This was the first of 2 reports that the Office of Inspector General has released. The second report they are still working on, and Democrats in the House will also be investigating these reports and these allegations.
Yeah, the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Exactly.
And is this related specifically to Iran, or is there a number of issues?
Absolutely. So there was at least one official who worked on Iran policy who was pushed out of state very likely because the Trump administration viewed this person as not towing the Trump administration's
so
line.
they're out.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
So at least
Lost their job because of their policy differences.
Yes. Now,
A democracy, huh?
exactly. In theory, yeah, that's what we've got so far, if we can keep it.
Thank you very much, Jessica. There's been a lot happening with Korea lately, but I want to ask about what might happen. What are the prospects for getting the talks going between North Korea and the United States on denuclearization? These were supposed to happen within a couple of weeks, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, and that was about a month ago.
That's right. Kim Jong-un and President Donald Trump had agreed at the inter-Korea border on June 30th to resume talks, but nothing has happened. And of course, the news that we're hearing about a potential reshuffling of Steve Biegun being appointed as ambassador to Russia is also disconcerting in the fact that he is our point contact, point person on talks with North Korea. And so we want to make sure that these talks between the United States and North Korea continue at both the working level and at the highest levels. And I think the lack of momentum over the last month, as you point out, is worrisome.
What do you think about Steve Biegun? How do you assess his role in the few months that we had him working on these issues?
He's very sharp. He has met with members of my community and has been very receptive to talks with the Korean American community and the broader public, as you know, on the issue of diplomacy with North Korea. So removing him in this pivotal role within the U.S. government at a time when we are, more or less stuck would be a real backsliding.
Yeah, I mean, he's qualified to be the ambassador to Moscow. This is part of his training. I think you were pointing out to me that he speaks Russian.
Right. He studied Russian in college.
Wow. Okay.
And his professional background has...
But Moscow's gain will be Korea's loss.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And meanwhile, bring us up to speed on the consequences of the missile test that Russia's been doing. That North Korea's been doing. They're modeled on Russian missiles. That's why I slipped right into that. These are about 6, if I understand correctly.
That's exactly right.
Just in the last 5 weeks.
That's exactly right. They're short-range ballistic missiles, which means they can't reach the continental United States.
So we don't care.
But they can reach American bases in Asia. They can reach, of course, American troops in Asia, and of course our allies, South Korea and Japan. So it's not a small matter. But the timing of these 6 tests is I think quite obvious to observers in that North Korea is trying to create a wedge between the United States and South Korea to say, look, as long as you guys do these rehearsal invasions, as North Korea calls it, the joint drills between U.S. and South Korean military, even though a lot of it is computer simulated, that there's no prospect of talks. And so this is a problem. I think North Korea's attempt to really create this wedge between the United States and South Korea is something that we need to call them out on. And I think the United States has to be really, aggressive in making sure South Korea as a co-equal partner in all this is included in any sort of ongoing talks.
Has this tactic worked? Have they been successful in driving a wedge between the U.S. and South Korea? What do you think? How do you assess the state of the alliance?
The direct exchanges of letters between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump.
I love you, Donald.
I love you. I love you back. And this, very public professing of love, certainly creates the public perception that the relationship between U.S. and North Korea is getting warmer, that they're establishing this trust, and there's just so much potential here for some sort of a breakthrough. And I think, the fact that we've been sort of mum on Kim Jong-un's, ridiculing of South Korean democratically elected President Moon Jae-in, when Kim Jong-un calls him, senseless and says these talks are of course not going to start, under these circumstances. That's problematic. And so, if we don't want this perception to persist that there's some sort of a wedge, then of course the United States should be much more forceful in, embracing South Korea's continued role.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mary, we're running a little short on time, but there's an important news out of Gibraltar.
Gibraltar, of all places, yes. So Gibraltar seized an Iranian oil tanker the U.S. has been attempting to pressure Gibraltar to hold on to this tanker, to not give in, as they think, to the Iranians. Gibraltar just released the oil tanker, again, in direct contradiction to what the Trump administration wanted them to do. I think this is further evidence that the Trump administration's attempt to sort of rally allies, at all levels against Iran, it's simply not working. So Tehran is playing the victim here, and everyone else is on the one side versus the Trump administration.
So you might say Gibraltar is not exactly a rock of U.S.-Iran policy?
Exactly.
Oh, God. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We are out of time. That's 7 minutes exactly. I want to thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Mary, for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Great to be here.
We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Welcome to a brand new Q&A segment of Press the Button, where we take the questions from you, our listeners, and give them to Joe. To be clear, Joe has not seen any of these questions, and neither, for that matter, have I. So if we'd like to make this a fairly regular segment. So if you'd like Joe to answer your questions, please send it in to pressthebutton@ploughshares.org. And now, Joe, this is what happens when you leave us for vacation. The mail piles up.
So you complain when I stay in touch when I'm on the beach or hiking in the mountains. But no, I have to. I have to watch you every minute.
That's right, or else we come up with new segments. Okay, you ready for this?
Yes, shoot.
Our first question comes from one of our listeners, Melissa, who asks, why does it seem like we are harsher on Iran when North Korea seems to be so much further along and more focused on use against the U.S.? Is it due to the threat against resources in the Persian Gulf? Is it due to geopolitics in the Pacific region versus the Gulf? Are there other factors at play?
Wow, great question, Melissa. Yes, let me tick off some of the factors. Number one, North Korea has nuclear weapons, Iran does not. I think that gives North Korea deterrence. We do not want to start a war with North Korea for where it can escalate. Number two, U.S. has key allies in the Middle East that do want to go to war with Iran. Israel, Saudi Arabia, to some extent the United Arab Emirates. They are pushing for a military conflict, at least a limited strike with Iran. We have no such U.S. allies in Northeast Asia who want us to go with North Korea. None whatsoever. And then I would say three, yes, I think you're right about the resources. The U.S. has historically felt that the Persian Gulf was vital to its national security interests, that we had to secure oil resources, the shipment of oil. We don't have that same kind of geo-resource imperative in Northeast Asia, at least not to that extent. I might just add in closing that I think this oil imperative is lessening. We care less and less about the oil from the Middle East, and perhaps in 40 or 50 years we won't care at all. That would be a good thing.
Do you think that there's any history as well, the relationship that the U.S. has had with Iran, or the terrible relationship U.S. has had with Iran versus North Korea, that plays into it?
Well, we have terrible histories with both countries.
It's true.
Remember, we killed 1 million North Koreans in the Korean War. We leveled North Korea. The Air Force complained at the end of that war that they had run out of targets. There was nothing else to bomb. We haven't had that kind of violent history to that extent with Iran. But of course, in 1953, we did overthrow the only ever democratic elected government in Iran and installed the Shah, who was overthrown some 25 years later in the 1979 revolution. So we have complicated histories with both countries.
And with that, I think that's the end of the segment for now.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm delighted to be here in the Washington headquarters of Ploughshares Fund with William Hartung, who is the director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
And I want you to tell our listeners what you can see out the window. here?
Well, as Joe often says, you can see the Washington Monument, which I didn't believe, but it's true.
It's true. Okay, it's not a complete view, but it's a pretty good shot of the Washington Monument.
You can tell what it is.
You can tell what it is. Thank you. Bill's going to talk to us about U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the corporate connection, about the Saudi lobby machine here in Washington, D.C., about contracts for the new ICBM, about his new report also, Sustainable Defense, More Security for Less Spending. In short, Bill, there's more to talk with you about than we can possibly get in. So I want to start off by having you promise that you'll come back for another conversation.
Absolutely.
Great. So we're going to go as far as we can into this, as much as we can, and then we'll continue it in part two in the weeks ahead. First, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself? How did you get started in this business?
Well, I grew up in a conservative suburb of Buffalo, New York, and I fled. I went to Columbia University. And my first exposure to this issue was I worked in the anti-apartheid movement as a student.
Huh.
And I specialized in writing about companies that were violating the arms embargo on South Africa. Then I got a job at a think tank called the Council on Economic Priorities, writing about corporate social responsibility. I did a newsletter on global arms trade, on the top defense contractors, wrote about missile defense. So that was really my training ground. And then I've been...
And when was this? What time
This
period?
was from late Carter through mid-Reagan.
Yeah.
So I'm dating myself.
Let me date myself with you. I think that's when I first started reading you. It was on your writings on missile defense in that period when I was in the House Armed Services Committee doing missile defense issues.
Yeah. Oh, see, I should claim credit for that. I didn't know. And then a series of think tanks. So I was at the World Policy Institute in New York. I did a stint at the New America Foundation. And now I'm at the Center for International Policy. So essentially I've been doing the same work, different organizations.
And what does the Arms and Security Project do?
Well, our main focus at Arms and Security Project are the global arms trade, the Pentagon budget, and nuclear policy. And basically how we can be safer by doing less of all those things.
Well, those are our sweet spots. So let's get going. What I want to particularly talk to you about is this new report, U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the corporate connection. Why did you write this report?
Well, Donald Trump is a big fan of bragging about his role as a deal maker. And even after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, he was saying, well, we got some great companies, we got some great deals, we can't jeopardize that. Essentially, he was saying, arms contracts trump murder. This guy's murdered, but hey, there's deals to be made, there's money to be made. And this is not a new phenomenon. These companies have lobbied for arms sales for decades. But Trump has embraced it in a way that no other president has. He shouts it from the rooftops. He's not at all embarrassed at putting the interests of these companies ahead of human rights and ahead of our strategic interests.
So what did you find? What does your report conclude?
Well, I'm not often surprised, but I was surprised that 90% of the value of the deals with Saudi Arabia since 2009, $125 billion worth of deals, involved just 4 companies.
Huh.
Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics. So they sold the fighter planes, they sold the bombs, they sold the combat ships, the attack helicopters, sort of an entire arsenal made in the USA. And that's how they're waging the war in Yemen, is primarily with weapons from the US as well as the United Kingdom.
I want to walk through a little bit of this report with you. So, but first, put this in context. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin. You wrote a whole book on Lockheed Martin.
I did.
What was it called?
Profits of War.
Profits of War. Boeing and General Dynamics. So these are the big 4. Are there any other companies that big in the defense, trade, the arms trade?
These are really the big players. I mean, there's BAE Systems, which makes howitzers. There's the small arms manufacturers who don't make nearly as much money, but of course their weapons do a great deal of damage.
And this is the result of the tremendous consolidation that's taken place in this field. Well, as long as you and I have been in it, we've seen go from dozens of firms down to really this big
Sure.
4.
I mean, Lockheed Martin.
Northrop Grumman, I guess you'd have to add it in there as well. Big 5.
Yes, they're significant.
Yes, and that's it. Those are the big ones. And so these guys, these 4, got 27 offers worth over $125 billion in these last 10 years, 2009 to 2019.
Exactly.
And so, and you start breaking it down. This really makes it very personal, and I think very sort of moving, even though this is a dry report. It is just the facts, ma'am, report. But you talk about this in a very personal way, that in 2016, there was a General Dynamics 2,000-pound bomb with a Boeing guidance system that hit a marketplace. I remember this strike, and killed 97 civilians in Yemen, including 25 children. Just last year, in August 2018, a Lockheed Martin laser-guided bomb hit a school bus. I remember this attack. It briefly made the papers, killed 51 people, including 40 children. And on, a Raytheon bomb, the GBU-12 Paveway. I remember in the Armed Services Committee when this was first developed. It's a very impressive system. This is a very capable bomb that was used to kill 21 people. I think that one involved a wedding party. These are brutal attacks. And we usually think about them as, a Saudi bombing raid, a Saudi attack. But it also would be accurate to talk about a Boeing bomb that killed these people, a Lockheed Martin bomb that killed these people. Is that why you're writing in this way, to sort of give corporate responsibility to these killings?
I think these companies are as responsible as our government for this killing. But, their position is, we're just doing what the government allows. We're just following government policy. And even if that were true, I think they bear moral responsibility. But in fact, they lobby the government to create the policy that allows them to sell the bombs that then kill the civilians. So they're part and parcel of the problem. They're not sort of standing back just following orders.
The most recent part of this arms trade between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia happened with Donald Trump's proposal to sell $8.1 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. Congress is required under normal conditions to approve that deal. They did not approve that deal. Donald Trump then declared an emergency and said he had to get it through. Congress then voted against it, explicitly voted to disapprove the deal, but Trump vetoed that congressional resolution and went ahead with the sale. Am I getting that right?
Yes. Basically what happened was, after the Khashoggi murder, and even prior, there had been a hold on a sale of precision-guided munitions by Senator Menendez. Then after the murder, what they were hearing from the Hill, both the administration and the contractors, was, don't you dare bring an arms sale up here. We're not going to arm this reckless regime. And even people like Lindsey Graham were saying this.
Yeah.
So Trump tried to do a maneuver around that. He used these emergency procedures, which would have done an end run around a congressional vote. Congress voted anyway. They voted down every element of the package, of which there were 22 different, tranches. And then Trump turned around, vetoed it. Then the Senate tried to override, but couldn't get enough votes. So there's been this huge contention, which really has been, in my experience, kind of the most assertive Congress has been over an arms sale to a particular country since I can remember.
Decades. You really have to go back to 1972 and the fight over selling AWACS planes to Saudi Arabia, which Israel opposed and was eventually disproved. But since then, I can't remember a big fight over arms sales.
Not like this. No, in the 70s, they created the Arms Export Control Act, which made them have to notify Congress, set up this voting procedure. Because of the arming of the Shah of Iran, the arming of Saudi Arabia, arms deals were turning up in the papers, and it was the first time members were hearing about them.
Yes.
So they wanted to clamp down on the system, but then that system was rarely used once they created it. And now it's, Congress is looking for every way possible to try to stop these sales.
So of this $81 billion, how much goes to the big four contractors?
More than half, about $4.3 billion.
Wow. So this is, what kind of weapons are we talking about?
Well, the biggest issue is the precision-guided munitions made by Raytheon, basically guided bombs.
Yes.
And there's 64,000 either bombs or components of bombs that are part of this deal.
64,000?
Yes. And some of those components will be built in Saudi Arabia. So President Trump is always bragging about the jobs that come from these deals. But in this case, a lot of the jobs will be in Saudi Arabia, not in Arizona, not anywhere in the United States.
So it's creating jobs, all right, just not here. Or
yes.
Not many jobs here.
Yes. In fact, there was a headline earlier in Trump's kind of touting these sales where they said, yes, indeed, U.S. arms sales are creating jobs in Saudi Arabia.
Let me ask you a question. What if we didn't sell these bombs to Saudi Arabia? What would happen to the Saudi war effort?
Well, first of all, the bombs themselves are the kind of fuel for the war. They're doing the killing. So without those bombs, they wouldn't be able to do this kind of killing. But then within that also is the spare parts, the maintenance. And Bruce Heidel has pointed out, if we weren't maintaining and giving them the spare parts, they'd have to ground their Air Force.
So we could stop this war if we wanted to. We don't have to wait for Saudi Arabia to decide it's in a quagmire, it's got to pull out, the way UAE apparently has just done.
Exactly.
We could stop it if we want to. This administration doesn't want to.
We have the leverage to do it. And a lot of people from the Obama years, where they had kind of a conflicted approach to this war, are now saying this is the time. We should stop the arms sales and we should stop the maintenance and support. We should basically ground their Air Force.
Right. Obama officials went ahead, gave the Saudi Arabians the green light to engage in this Yemen civil war, but then came to regret it.
Exactly. And at the end of Obama's term, he suspended a sale of precision-guided munitions, which then Trump turned around and overturned early in his first term.
So let me bring another part of this in, and this is something else you've written about, which is the Saudi lobby machine. Your colleague Ben Freeman at the Center wrote on April 17th a global opinion for the Washington Post called "The Saudi Lobbying Machine Continues to Exert Influence on Congress and Trump." So in addition to the contracts that are going to these contractors who are doing their own lobbying, what's Saudi Arabia doing and how effective is it?
Well, they're one of the most effective lobbies in Washington. It's interesting, we hear a lot about Russian interference in our democracy. We don't hear as much about Saudi interference in our foreign policy, but it's equally important, I would say. And, Ben found that, for example, they employ more than 24 lobbying firms. They spent $15 million in 2018 on those firms. They had 2,000 contacts, either with the media, with members of Congress. They contacted virtually every Senate office, 200 House offices. In a number of cases, right after the lobbyists met to pitch arms sales to Saudi Arabia, they gave a contribution to that member's campaign.
Yes, you specifically call out, Ben does in his article, Inhofe, right? And like a few others.
Yes, exactly.
Getting significant contributions to the campaign after the lobbyist visit.
And these countries can't do it directly, but this is a way of kind of laundering the contribution. You do it through your lobbying firm.
You say it's the most effective. How do you judge that?
Well, I think because for so many years they went unchallenged. I think it's changing now because of the Khashoggi murder, because of the focus on the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. They haven't been able to stop Congress from acting. And I think
that's true.
The most effective lobbyist they have now is Donald Trump. And he's really the sticking point in trying to change the policy.
And do you see the Saudi influence lessening in this town? And I think Ben talks mainly about the congressional lobbying, but there's a whole other aspect, and tell me if you've studied this, of the contributions to the think tanks, the academic institutions, the kind of general PR that the Saudis do.
There's been a few institutions that have pulled back. Brookings stepped back from a Saudi contribution. Center for American Progress stopped taking money from the UAE after huge controversy over that. But the money's still flowing, and there are places like the Middle East Institute, which gets UAE money, which essentially pushes the UAE line on this stuff to a significant degree. So, that may almost be more insidious because it's very hard to find out who's getting funded by these companies. Ben is actually doing a study on that as well. He's sort of like the Saudi lobby hunter in Washington.
Yes, to sort of expose this a bit, at least be transparent about it.
We should at least know where the money's coming from.
Right, it isn't necessarily true that if you get Saudi money, therefore you parrot the Saudi line, but we should at least know that there's a potential conflict of interest here. If you're commenting on Middle East policy and a lot of your money is coming from one Middle East country, we should know about it.
Exactly, because there's some great analysts across the spectrum in D.C., some of whose institutions undoubtedly get money from Saudi and UAE. But I think the overall picture needs to be out there in the public eye.
Let me ask you something. This is a personal story. I was at a Georgetown dinner discussion months ago when the effort to block the Saudi arms sale came up. And it was in a group of former Obama and Clinton officials. And I took the position that we should cut off the arms sales. We should just block it, period. And one of the former officials, who now has a consulting firm, said, no, you're not going to be able to block it. We should condition it. We should require the Saudis to take greater care to make sure the bombs are not used against civilian targets. I won't tell you my opinion of that, but I want to know yours. What do you think of that kind of approach?
Well, it's a family program, so I'll sanitize my remarks. But
I don't know if it's a family program. You think people gather around their iPhone and listen together to this?
Of course. They're sharing earbuds and
Okay.
But anyway, I think that argument, if it ever had any currency, is long past. I mean, they've been bombing hospitals, marketplaces, water treatment plants, a wedding, a school bus. Many of these were marked as no-go targets. So basically, they're not even trying not to hit civilians. And the Obama administration did try for a time to get them to be more careful with very little result. And of course, the argument was, well, if they have precision-guided munitions, then they'll miss the civilians. They'll get the targets they want. But it appears that they're engaging in some kind of exercise in collective punishment, basically saying we're going to bombard your country until you turn against the Houthi and you support the government that we want to see in Yemen, because it's not just a question of mistakes. There's too many of these for them to just be mistakes. And I think there might be other situations, other countries, but not this regime. I don't think conditioning it on them being careful is really going to get us anywhere at this late date.
Right. So this kind of position, which is presented in Washington as the realistic position, in fact, is profoundly unrealistic. It's not going to accomplish anything. It's not going to stop the war. It's not going to stop the civilian casualties.
Exactly. I mean, we have to stop the killing. That's really what we need to do.
Thank you. Bill, let me shift you over to another subject, away from the Middle East and into the Great Plains of America, where we have our ICBM fields. Something very interesting just happened. One of the big four, Boeing, pulled out of the competition for the contract for the new intercontinental ballistic missile. You and Jessica Slight wrote about this, ICBM, who needs them, or some title. We had Jessica on just 2 weeks ago talking about that article, but I want to get your take on this. What does it mean that Boeing is not competing for this contract anymore?
Well, I think in the narrow sense, it's going to cost the government more money. I mean, if there's no competition up front, then the remaining competitor, who doesn't have a competitor, has a freer rein to set
Who's the
higher
remaining
prices.
Competitor? Northrop
Grumman, yeah. So basically, they'll be in the catbird seat in terms of their negotiations with the Pentagon, because the Pentagon will have nowhere else to turn.
It'll be a single source. Okay.
And this is a small part of the larger $1.5 trillion nuclear weapons buildup over the next 3 decades. So it's hard to believe that you could push that number higher, but this could actually do that.
And the total amount we're talking here, I saw one figure on an $85 billion contract. I had seen an estimate that the new ICBM project was going to cost about $120 billion. So
yes.
This is just this one part of it then.
Yes,
the biggest part, I guess.
And then, of course, there's operations and all the follow-on expenses after you build the thing. And most of them have cost overruns well beyond the initial estimates.
So if you could make the decision on this, what would you do about this contract?
Well, I think we're focused on the wrong question.
Huh.
It's not who's competing for it, is why do we build these things in the first place? And I think Global Zero and Jessica Slate made an excellent case in their alternative nuclear posture that, first of all, submarine-launched ballistic missiles are a better deterrent. They're invulnerable. Second of all, ICBMs are a target. They draw attention to the areas where they're deployed. And worst of all, the president has to decide in a matter of minutes, whether or not to launch these things, which means an accidental nuclear war is much more likely. Bill Perry called them probably the most dangerous weapons on the planet. So instead of worrying about $1 billion here, $1 billion there, can we compete it? Let's just get rid of them altogether.
Right. ICBMs were important when they used to be prompt launch hard target killers. So I remember this. When we couldn't do that from submarines, but now we can. We can do everything a land-based missile can do from a submarine, which is invulnerable. The enemy doesn't know where it is. You can have it stay underwater. You can keep it in reserve. You can take your time and decide whether you want to launch it. So the case for ICBMs has largely disappeared, but the programs haven't.
Exactly.
The states that have them still get jobs from them. This is still basically a contractor-driven program.
And there's an ICBM Coalition, which is made up of senators from the states where these things are based. And they've been very successful. You know, they tried to limit the number that were reduced under New START. They tried to make sure none of the silos
they warned Obama if he got a number from the New START agreement with the Russians that was too low, they wouldn't support it. And every vote counted in the Senate, and Obama had to change the number to suit the ICBM caucus.
And even destroying the empty silos, they said, oh no, we might need those. We might build up again. So they really, they kind of draw a line, no possible change in ICBM policy. And they make strategic arguments, but of course, it's about parochial interests.
Let me ask you this before we end. Let me start with a story. I was recently in San Diego where I talked to something that's called the Nuclear Boot Camp for young graduate students who are not just entering the field. And I was the sort of the opposition voice here, given the other point of view. And I talked about this, and I really have come to the view that it's contracts that are driving the strategic debate in this country more than ideology, more than a difference over grand strategy. But we just don't see it, because especially here in Washington or at these academic institutes, we debate strategy. But I see us as just sort of ants on the dragon that are having this debate, but the dragon is what's driving it. And it's a $55 billion a year industry, what we spend on nuclear weapons and related programs every year, $55 billion, and it just drives through this town. And it's not really so much about us arguing with those ants who think that the dragon is good. It's about stopping the dragon. As Game of Thrones has taught us, you can kill dragons. But I was wondering what you think. Am I being too materialistic here? Am I giving too much power to the industry? How do you see the drivers of the nuclear policy debate?
I did a piece a while ago in a book by Helen Caldicott called Sleepwalking to Armageddon.
Huh.
And it was an edited volume, and it was at the New Press. So guess what? It wasn't on the bestseller list. But my focus was the nuclear industrial complex and how it really went back to the beginning of the nuclear age. One of the reasons I gave the military industrial complex speech is because the Air Force and the contractors and hawks in Congress were trying to get him to build a strategic bomber that he didn't want to build. He was a fiscal conservative. He was like, well, why do we need all these things? Why do we need 3 different ways to do this? But they were able to ultimately prevail in that fight. And likewise, the doctrine. The Navy had a doctrine that favored submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The Air Force had a doctrine that favored land-based missiles. And it was all about really fighting over turf and money. In fact, one of the Air Force generals, or one of the admirals rather, described the Air Force as worse than the communists, because they were sneaking around behind our backs and, getting access to control who targets. And if you control targeting, then you can argue what kind of weapons you need to hit those targets, and then you're in gravy.
Yes.
So even way back then, as those doctrines that are still being debated were being formed, there was this, economic turf war going on. And you even had, one of the senators, Stuart Symington, was tight with somebody from Convair, which made the Atlas missile. So he wanted to build as many Atlas missiles as possible before the next generation came in, because Convair wasn't going to get the contract for the next generation, the Minuteman. So let's build them all now, So there was a lot of even very kind of gross lobbying, and it was that kind of thing that motivated Eisenhower to give the military-industrial speech. So really a lot of it was about the nuclear enterprise.
That is fascinating. And you're right. It's the targeting doctrine. People don't talk about that enough. They don't understand that these requirements that you have to have, for example, at least 2, sometimes 3 or 4 warheads on each target, and that they have to be delivered by different delivery vehicles. I mean, what is that but a requirement for the system that you build? Does it have strategic logic? Some. But in this day and age, do you really need to hit a target with a bomber, a sub-launch missile, and an ICBM?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think the thing about, you've got these economic roots, but also the ideology takes on a life of its own. The triad becomes sacrosanct.
The Holy Trinity.
And anybody who questions it is viewed as unrealistic, as soft, and so forth. But in fact, it's the highest form of realism to say, we don't need a lot of these things, and they're making our lives more dangerous.
Well, Bill, I want to thank you very much for coming in and sharing some of your recent research with us. I hope you'll come back again.
Be glad to.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.